Hey everybody, I hope you're ready for a great semester of American government, and I hope you had a great summer break, most importantly. Before we begin, I just want to briefly introduce myself. My name is Devin Marconi. I'm from Richmond, Virginia, but I've had family roots in Montana, Scobie, Montana specifically, for generations. So I moved up here a few years ago to study political science and a couple other things because, well, we all know college, it takes a few adjustments before you find your major. I studied business, journalism. At first, I originally obtained a bachelor's in political science with a concentration on international relations, alongside a bachelor's in Central Southwest Asian Studies, which I always describe to people as history and politics of the Middle East, most specifically. I went on to continue studying at University of Montana again to get a master's in political science, where I spent a lot of time focusing on the impact of political polarization, specifically within markets within the United States. I will not be able to go into too much depth on that throughout this course, but one of the provided paper topics that you can choose is regarding political polarization, and I am happy to talk about that with you via Zoom, email, text, whatever you desire. Talking about that, I want to emphasize how important communication is in this course. If you ever have any issues or any questions, or you just want to yell at me about your opinions, well, hopefully we're not too opinionated in this course. We'll go into that later on. I want you to know that you can reach out to me anytime. I am happy to discuss any and all issues you have at any time. So please reach out. Happy to talk. A little bit more about me before I get into the course. I mentioned I'm from Richmond, Virginia. I'm a diehard Knicks fan. I love me some basketball. Like sports in general. So if you ever want to rant or yell about your favorite sports, baseball, football, basketball, baseball, I'm having a good year. Mets fan, I gotta like that. Football, don't talk to me about football. I'm a Jets and Giants fan, so we'll talk about that in another decade, because that's about how long it'll take for that to even out. But that's enough about me and non-government related things. Please reach out anytime. I love to talk about any and all things. So to go on and address this course. So first off, what we're doing today, we're going to start talking about some of the content. But before we do that, I want to go over some expectations of the course, how it's structured, and really cover what I think is one of the most beneficial like PowerPoint lectures I have to give, which is what I'll cover when we talk about what the state and democracy is. Because for me, when I thought about politics this way, it helped bring a pivotal shift in my ability to discuss politics and how beneficial those discussions were to me and those around me. So we'll talk about that. We're going to dive into the content, as you can see listed here. Since we have to talk about the expectations and have a good amount of overview, I will not spend too much time on the learning objectives today, although I will be going over them every week in the future. So, what's expected of you in this course? First off, we're going to have discussion posts and general participation requirements that take up 10%. You are expected to contribute to a discussion post every single week. This is a bit confusing for students of the past, but I have provided so many explanations that I now believe you can do this without too many difficulties. Additionally, I am happy to answer any of your questions via email, text, or Zoom if you need. So make sure you look at the discussion post requirements document to make sure you understand that there are a total of 4 posts you must make to every discussion thread, 3 of which are due in the first week that the discussion post is assigned, an original response to the topic. My questions that I asked you, I need you to respond to them in details. And then additionally, I need you to ask 2 classmates a question about their response. Do not say, I like what you said. Good job, Sue. Whatever it is, I don't care how much you agree with your classmates. I care how much you engage with your classmates. That does not have to be negative, and it doesn't have to be positive. It has to be objective and empirically driven. So let the data drive your responses to other people's discussions. Ask them a question. Have an attempt to understand them in more depth. Additionally, we will have quizzes. Oh, before I go past that, participation, I will be going through 5 randomized lectures and randomized readings to determine that you access them within the required window, and that will be a part of your grade. Additionally, quizzes, 25% of your grade. These are important. You have 4 quizzes in this course. your lowest quiz grade will get dropped. That is why your quiz grade is such a high percentage of your course grade, because you have a version of extra credit and you have a little bit of flexibility to specialize in one section of the course over another. We will have 4 sections in this course. The quizzes will cover each of those sections. The last section of the course, we will have a lecture on foreign policy, which will not be a part of the last quiz, but will be on the final exam. Mentioning the final exam, that will be cumulative. It will ask you all the questions I asked you throughout the semester, in addition to a couple more relating to those last lecture or last 2 lectures, depending on how the course goes and the amount of work we get done towards the end. Additionally, you have 4 or more class assignments. I believe we actually have 5 currently assigned, including one very quick one that is due next week, where you select what your essay topic will be. These assignments range from writing 2-page essays to answering some simple and quick questions. So make sure you're paying attention to the assignments. They will be due at Sunday at 11:59 p.m. by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. the week they are assigned. So make sure you are turning in your assignments. The syllabus tells you what weeks we have assignments due and when they are due. So we covered the final essay. We'll cover the final exam. We will have a final essay. First off, that is the essay you're choosing your topic on next week. So we are going to be talking about and addressing this assignment throughout the entire course. Your midterm will be a rough draft of the first page of your final essay. This will be where I help you craft an ideal introduction, which is a very important part of your essay writing abilities, something that when I was an undergraduate, I did not craft and work on enough, and I hope that the way we are doing the midterm and final essay helps you improve your writing abilities beyond just writing an essay for the course. So you'll write a midterm that will be 1 page, that will act as your introduction, provide the best introduction and thesis statement you possibly can. I will tear it to shreds with respect, that I will tear every midterm submission to shreds in an aim to provide you direction for how to write your final essay. So this will be a guided final essay. Because I will be guiding you on how to write your final essay and improve your midterm, I will have strict requirements on that final essay. There will not be a single 100%. The highest grade I have given on a final essay is a 97%, as it is nearly impossible to write a perfect college level essay. But I will work with you, and that is why there are going to be such high expectations. So that is what is expected in this course. Again, here's a slide covering the discussion post requirements in detail. Please make sure you provide detailed answers to all your discussion posts. At least 5 full sentences. In your beginning introduction, you must ask a question to your classmates when you respond to their responses, and there will be a final follow-up due the following week after your original discussion post requirements were due, where you respond to a classmate's question that they asked you. So please make sure you review this, and if you have any questions about the discussion posts, just reach out to me. So let's talk about this content. What are we studying in this course? Well, Introduction to American Government covers a lot of important subfields within the social sciences, specifically relating to, of course, the American government. So in this course, we're going to utilize history, philosophy, psychology, linguistics, economics, demographics, and so much more that are hard to just quickly list in a PowerPoint slide. When you look at studying political science at large, I think some of this information is beneficial if you're like me and you take this class and find a passion in it, which is what I did at my community college over in Richmond, Virginia. Used to be called John Tyler, now it's Bright Point. Go Bright Point. So when you study political science, you can go 3 different directions, generally up to 4 different directions, generally within the United States. But political science at large focuses on international relations. Think of that as there is an international arena of states interacting, and studying that interaction is what you do in international relations. Political theory, it's kind of like the psychology of politics. Why do people think the way they think, and what are these detailed thoughts? How can we explain powers and authority through understandings of ourselves and society around us? And then comparative politics. Compare nations, the systems that they rely upon, the constitutions that they maintain, whatever aspects you can analyze in a comparative sense between nations. So political science, generally speaking, We're studying governmental systems, the people that run them, and the people that are governed by them. It is important to understand all three of these elements. And when I talk about political science, I always have the one-liner that I like to tell anybody who might chuckle at my degrees and experience, or might get excited about the conversations that we may be able to have. There are two things that happen in the world. There's within the political world. There's politics and there's government. We're not here to discuss politics, the focus of names, personalities, and current events as much. We're more so focused on government, history, institutions, some current events, as we have to understand how these institutions develop and build upon history. But we are here to study government. We're here to study the objective truth and help strengthen each of our individual abilities to represent ourselves. That is our objective in this course. Not to talk about politics, but to understand government and how best to represent ourselves within it. Now, I like to ask everybody in the first lecture I provide in American government, what is a state? Ask yourself this. What is a state? The United States is a great example of one, but what is a state on an international level? Well, here are 4 different definitions of what a state is. And as I read them, I want you to ask yourself, what definition rings true? What definition do political scientists unanimously agree defines a state? The first definition, quote, any power which has authority over men, end quote. Oh, that's fascinating. You're covering systems that regulate our lives, but it kind of diminishes the focus on the individuals being governed. Also, men, women, children, too, all humans. You can't have such a narrow focus. Maybe it's a little outdated. Well, who knows? We'll see. Number 2, quote, a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. That's a lot. A human community, so you can't be a bunch of ants. That's no ant communities. You got to successfully claim the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force. We're not playing Monopoly. This is not a board game. What does that mean? Monopoly, we all know you're the sole authority. You are in charge. You have conquered the market. You're the man with the top hat. The monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force. Physical force, think of violence. The legitimate use of physical force. So if you maintain a monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force, that means others cannot use physical force to address their conflicts. An example of others using physical force to address conflicts you could think of being the Wild West with duels, when you would have conflicts being addressed through use of physical force between both entities. In contemporary days, we see you wouldn't go out into the streets and have a duel. Instead, you would utilize the state, the police, mobilized by the state, who have the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force. And within a given territory, you wouldn't call the police in Canada. You'd call the Montana, probably Sheriff's Department, probably Kalispell Police, whatever it may be. Whatever small entity you must call for, you would have a specific given territory in which there is a monopoly of force among humans within the community, and that is how you understand that there is a state that exists. If these 3 requirements are met, humans, monopoly of force within a specific given territory. Fascinating, very scientific, I guess you could say, making requirements. The third, quote, a union of families and villages having for its end a perfect and self-sufficing life, by which we mean a happy and honorable life. Oh, we're talking about the end goal here. The end goal is important for understanding if it is a state or not. Having in its end a perfect and self-sufficing life, happy and honorable life, a focus on the fruits of the state's actions, focusing on what the state provides to the people with a simple starting point of families and villages, as you can't have a state if you didn't originally start by the building up of community on some scale, which of course starts on the individual, then family, then village level. That's pretty, I like that. Number 4, quote, a body of free persons united together for the common benefit to enjoy peaceably what is their own and to do justice to others, end quote. I like it. Justice. We like justice in the United States. Free persons, we're some free persons. You can't deny that. United together for the common benefit to enjoy peaceably what is their own, that is good. That kind of focuses on how the state has a responsibility to protect property, which is something we've heard from the great theorist of John Locke and many of our early founding fathers. Some we'll hear again. All those are fascinating definitions. If you ask me, I'm a political scientist in heart. That second definition has those requirements. That sounds nice. That if I had these listed to me, I would say that second definition has to be the one that political scientists rely on to define a state. But the reality is, every single one of these definitions represent what a state is. Now, if you talk to somebody and you rely on that first definition while they rely on the second, and you say, we need to strengthen the state, you might have two very different understandings of what needs to be done. Somebody focusing on that first definition, who wants to strengthen the state, power which has authority over men, they would strengthen the authority that the state has over individuals. Now, if number two wanted to focus on strengthening the state, they would focus on building up a police presence. Similar to the first, but let's include the third. What if the third person wanted to improve the state using the third definition? Well, they would increase measures that would improve the happiness of individuals. That might very much so look different than increasing the funding to the police. This has no relation to contemporary politics. What matters is that we can see that if you rely on one of these definitions and you're talking to somebody about what to do to strengthen our state, if you do not provide the definition you rely on, you might not be able to have an understanding of what you're saying. That other person might not be able to understand what you mean by strengthen the state. And they may have a very conflicting vision of what must be done to strengthen that state. Now, I also want to mention, these are all respected definitions. The first, stemming from a great political theorist of history, Machiavelli. The second, coming from a little more contemporary days, but not too recent, in 1946, a great political scientist by the name of Max Weber provided that definition. The third, one of the earliest definitions we've seen in political theory, stemming from the spoken word of Aristotle. And the fourth definition is a definition provided through legal court procedures and summarized by the United States Supreme Court. We see that all four of these definitions are relied upon to define a state in contemporary politics. These are the four among many other definitions of a state. And when you talk about politics and you use terms as simple and as given as what is a state, well, make sure you provide your definition, because that could progress the benefits that you can obtain out of your political discussion immensely. Help others understand the definition you rely on while maintaining an objective to understand the definition that they rely on when they use terms like a state. And we can have the same discussion about a term like democracy. Now, since it's just me talking to a screen and I don't have feedback from you immediately, I'm not going to do that for this slide, but simply tell you that first definition, a deviant constitution for the benefit of the poor but not for its common profit. Well, that person must not like democracy that much. But that person defines democracy in that way. Well, that person is Aristotle. A second definition of democracy, a government of, by, and for the people. You know, when I do the discussion post, which you will have to respond to, the vast majority of you select this definition. Well, because it's from one of our great American presidents, Abraham Lincoln. And the third, the institutional arrangement for arriving at political decisions in which individuals acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's vote. We've gone through three definitions of democracy, and it was the third one when elections were first included in a defining description of this system of government. Fascinating. Somebody relying on the third definition might focus more so on strengthening democracy, the elections within a democracy, than an individual relying on the first or second definition. Fascinating. Provide your definitions when you talk about politics. Thanks for my rant here, listening to my rant, but now let's talk about some objective measures, that objective understandings we have to have when talking about political science at large. Oh, also that third definition provided by Joseph Schumpeter, a great political scientist who will be referenced in this course and many others that you might take in the future. So, the United States democracy. Now we talked about the different definitions that we could all maintain or dismiss, and you have the right to maintain, prioritize, or focus on any of those definitions. Hopefully you can provide the definition you rely on when talking about politics, but let's make sure we have a objective, universal understanding of how the United States is a democracy. So for one, what is a direct democracy? That's when people govern the state directly by the state holding a vote before performing any action. Are we a direct democracy? Do we have constant ballot referendums? Are we able to vote before our Congress makes a decision? No, we do not have a direct democracy. Although we have measures like ballot referendums that do allow us to have access as if it were a direct democracy. But we also understand that in the United States, we maintain what many refer to as a representative democracy. This is when citizens have the right to elect representatives who then govern the state for them. We will look at different forms of representation, delegate representation or trustee representation, but we will wait until later on in this course to address those concepts, basically referencing the way elected representatives govern our interests. I also want to address the term a constitutional republic. As I've given this lecture in person in the past, I've had numerous students raise their hand the second they see me call the United States a representative democracy, because they say, but wait, we are a constitutional republic. That is what the founding fathers drafted our Constitution as. They did not call us the greatest democracy, they called us a great republic. What is a constitutional republic? Which, by the way, the United States is. A constitutional republic is a regime in which a scheme of representation takes place, in addition to the system being defined and limited by a constitution. Limited, a key word we will dive into more detail on later on when we talk about the interpretations of our Constitution and the different ways to interpret our Constitution. Well, we see representative democracy and a republic are two terms that are almost used interchangeably. And you can see that. Before we move on to the next slide, we have to understand the U.S. is a representative democracy and a constitutional republic. And according to James Madison in his writings in Federalist Paper number 10 and 14, among others, and among other founding fathers' texts, we see that he refers to a democracy as small extent of territory with constant assembly to make laws and address important matters, and refers to a republic as a regime in which a scheme of representation takes place. So we understand James Madison's definition of republic is interchangeable to contemporary definitions of a representative democracy. And they did not use the term democracy because they believed that we are electing representatives instead of having constant engagement and constant assembly. So it is better to define the state as a republic, although as language develops, we have developed to use democracy more frequently to define the United States constitutional republic when referring to it as a representative democracy. Now, when we talk about democracy, we're talking about the ways a government can be structured. Well, there are three different systems of government that we must understand and be able to visualize in this course before we continue on. Those are unitary, confederal, and federal systems. The United States has maintained two of these systems in its entire history. First off, we can see with this image to the left, let me see if this red dot function will work well. This right here, a unitary system of government. That is when you have a central governmental authority with a high concentration of power and influence. This power and influence is then dictated downwards in a simple manner, you can use that language, to the states. The central government has authority over determining the legislation and actions of individual state levels. Let's talk about the United States example. If we were a unitary government, the federal government in Washington, D.C. would have influence over what the state, a greater influence over what the state of Montana, Virginia, and New Jersey would do with their legislation. So we see that we are not and have never been a unitary system of government. Now, let's continue on to this central image of a confederal system of government. And of course, we see these arrows were pointing downward for unitary. And when we look at confederal, we see these state entities. There can be more than two. I think it was just done with two to provide a simpler example and make the graphic fit. So pretend there are 3 states here if you would like. This is where these states hold the concentration of power and influence within a system of government. So imagine Montana and Virginia right here would determine what Washington, D.C. does on a day-to-day basis. We would have state legislatures having far more influence over foreign relations in the United States if we were a confederal system of government. We are not currently a confederal system of government, although you will learn in a moment we had a system of government called the Articles of Confederation that was implemented prior to the United States Constitution, in which we had a confederal system in place for a very brief period of time. We will talk about that in the next few slides and what resulted in the abolition of the confederal system of government in the United States. Now, this image to the right, where you can see central government, 3 state entities, and extra lines with directions going both ways. This represents a federal system of government in which you have an equal exchange of power and influence between state and central government authorities. Think of Washington, D.C. being able to determine certain laws throughout the entire nation while allowing Montana, Virginia, and New Jersey to determine their individual state policies when the central government does not directly dictate what must be done. Now, dictate is a strong word to choose to use when determining the influence within a federal system, as there is equal exchange of influence within a federal system of government. Visualized by these arrows, central government has more power in a unitary system. The central government has far less power in a confederal system, and the central government has equal power in a federal system. The United States is currently a federal system of government. This is a verbal explanation of those 3 systems of government. Now, let's move on to a little bit back. Let's rewind a bit in history. Remember, we were not always a federal system of government, and we were not always a confederal system of government either. We were originally colonies. We remember U.S. history from high school, and I will not bore you with that many hour lecture, which I could do, but instead I will just try and maintain this one slide to focus on the economic incentives of the time. We had incentives for the colonists to hold a revolution while also maintaining significant incentives for Britain to avoid a revolution, of course. The incentives for the colonists, we remember the Boston Massacre. There was violence enacted upon the citizens of the individuals within the colonies. We had a tax on tea, a stamp act, a tax on mail services. We were paying significantly high taxes that were all being sent back to Great Britain. And this encouraged individuals to mobilize in aims of encouraging greater representation within the colonies and the governments that determine their actions. As we, of course, remember, no taxation without representation echoed through the newspapers and streets of colonial America. We also see the incentives that Britain maintained for avoiding a revolution because, well, this went on for a while and they fought quite hard to maintain the United States, well, not the United States, the American colonies. We see that their incentive, beyond the raw materials we remember hearing about when we were in high school, was also the monopoly of trade they maintained over these raw materials. They could buy these raw materials from the colonies at incredibly low prices and then be the sole distributors for the rest of the world in obtaining these raw materials, often resulting in significant markups, providing a lot of profit with high margins for Britain at the time. So this was economically very lucrative for Britain to maintain colonies in the Americas, regardless of civil unrest, regardless of whatever issues may come up at the time. So we see that there was an economic incentive for Britain to maintain the American colonies. Now, we had led a revolution against Britain's leadership over our colonies. And we did not immediately implement the U.S. Constitution. And instead, there was a good amount of years between that American Revolution and the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. And what lied in between was referred to as the Articles of Confederation. This is a system of government in which we had a confederal system of government where we had highly influential states working together to determine the actions and policies of the central government. When we look at the incentives for creating the articles, we have to remember the primary concerns of all Americans at the time were to avoid becoming another monarch. We just revolted against Great Britain, and we see in the Anti-Federalist Papers a lot of this sentiment. We have spent blood, yet we want to become another nation that mirrors those that we just revolted against, is a summary of what is echoed in the Anti-Federalist Papers, which we will talk about next week. But they wanted to avoid becoming another monarch, so they made sure that their central authority was incredibly weak. But they also wanted to avoid the secession of states because they were unified. They were in multiple colonies, creating individual states. And they wanted to make sure that these states did not struggle to defend themselves and conflict with each other. Instead, we needed to make sure we were a unified nation and avoid the secession of states. Done so by strengthening each state as much as we possibly could. We also wanted to avoid becoming subservient to foreign powers. During that revolution, we incurred a lot of debt, especially on state levels. States had to fund the war they were engaging in, and these were not wealthy individuals to begin with. So we had foreign debts at the time in numerous states. That varied by state, of course. We also had to protect natural rights. We see this in the text of our founding fathers, focusing on individual liberties, natural rights, echoing the sentiments of John Locke in his works that were published just prior to the Revolution in this time period, which are representative of the sentiments of many of our founding fathers. We'll go into them in a separate course in political theory, although after we finish this section, I do want to very briefly give a lecture on John Locke's influence, some psychology, philosophy, and ideology present in the United States. We'll talk about that later on. But also, when we talk about creating the Articles of Confederation, we wanted to protect laws from men. What does that mean? Well, we are a nation of laws, not of men, John Adams said in his works. We also see, quote, in questions of power, then let no more be heard of confidence in men, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution, end quote, written by Thomas Jefferson. We see these texts focusing on providing a system of government that is not vulnerable to the interests of single individuals or single time periods. We're creating a nation that is strongest through its institutions. It's strongest through what is inherited by past generations, not what this generation can exclusively provide. That is a focus by our founding fathers that first created the Articles of Confederation, in which we had a confederal system with strong states, but an incredibly weak central government. Now, when you have a system of government that is incredibly weak centrally, but has many strong individual states, what happens when there is a rebellion? Well, Shays' Rebellion answers that question quite well. Shays' Rebellion was a farmers' rebellion in western Massachusetts. I got to get rid of my dots. In which individuals were facing crushing debts and high taxes. Many were Revolutionary War veterans who had not paid for their services. And we see that in this, they were not paid for their services in the war. We see that the causes of this rebellion were that State governments demanded tax payments in hard currency, gold and silver, yet were not accepting various funds. We saw foreclosures on farms and debtors. Imprisonment were widespread. There were no effective federal responses due to the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. By no effective responses, not only did the federal government not send troops when there were violent upbringings, instead, they did not even get together to discuss legislative actions that could be done to address these issues. The federal government, the central government, sat silent as there were lives being spent and individuals protesting adamantly, leading rebellions against the policies, primarily economic policies, that were restricting their livelihood. So we see at this rebellion, protesters tried to shut down courts to prevent foreclosures. This climaxed in a failed attempt to seize the federal arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1787, and the rebellion was eventually put down by a privately funded militia, not by federal troops. So it needed a privately funded collective to end this conflict. Now, we saw, because of this event, that the Articles of Confederation was far too weak to respond to the needs of its citizens. Individuals could not rely on a central government to send troops, to address policies that were harming their own citizens, or to really have any engagement with the events that were happening on the grounds inside the nation. So we see, as a result, this resulted in, we see lives were lost, a rebellion was led, and we now know that the Articles of Confederation is far too weak to provide the stability and strength and protection that a state must provide its citizens. And so we are now realizing, as leaders within our early American system, that we need to reevaluate. This system, in which we have extremely strong states united loosely under a confederation, is not responsive. So we must have a constitutional convention. So here's a written version of what I just said. Shays' Rebellion revealed the weaknesses of the federal government and incentivized the Constitutional Convention of 1787, and that is where our founding fathers met to alter the Articles of Confederation in order to create a stronger central government to respond to threats like Shays' Rebellion. In this convention, we saw the stepping away of the Articles of Confederation and the formation of the United States system of government, later eventually ratifying a U.S. Constitution, which was debated and drafted at this Constitutional Convention. Additionally, when talking about how we will structure this new form of government, because our past government failed, we need to restructure government entirely. We need to start from scratch. Well, we started by debating how our legislature should look. And as we're debating this, we also see the writings and publications by two different collectives, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, representing two different sides of the argument about how to structure our new government. This continued on as we did not have an immediate ratification of the U.S. Constitution through these writings and publications, which we will talk about in detail next week. But the Constitutional Convention resulted in two primary takeaways that we want to focus on in today's lecture. That is the Great Compromise and the Three-Fifths Compromise. So let's start with the Great Compromise. So this originated from two different proposals, two contrasting proposals on how to structure our government. First, we had the Virginia Plan. Let's go Virginia, where I'm from. This was written by James Madison, in which he proposed a two-body legislative branch, something that might look like a House of Representatives and a Senate. I don't know, two bodies, that's all he focused on. And these bodies, when we talk about how many people will represent each of these bodies, he wanted both of them to be based on the population of each state. So we'll have two bodies separate from each other in which legislation will be debated, both based on population, so they will both have equal representation. We also see in this proposal, the Virginia Plan, James Madison additionally proposed three branches of government with checks and balances between them. I could go on a rant about Montesquieu and his writings of separation of church and state and how it resulted in this concept of checks and balances between three systems. I'll do that in a later lecture or via email. It's fun, it's fascinating. It shows how history is really just a bunch of people messing up and then positive things happening downstream. So let's continue on. We see that the Virginia Plan by James Madison is not the system we have in place today. So how do we go from the Virginia Plan to the U.S. Constitution? Well, another individual by William Patterson, you might know of him if you've applied for colleges in Virginia, it proposed another plan, the New Jersey Plan. Well, we see the New Jersey Plan calling for a single governing body in Congress. Forget the House and the Senate, we just want Congress. And this body, well, New Jersey is a very small state via population. So if it's based on population, New Jersey has no influence. So instead of having population-based representation, we need to have representation-based equally and representation equally distributed between states. New Jersey, Virginia, we have equal representation. And additionally, in this New Jersey Plan, we see proposals for a Supreme Court, a high court of Supreme Court justices to determine the interpretation of legislative actions, and a federal agency to tax trade, which more detailed but interesting aspect. Well, what did we have in the end? Well, in the end, we had a two-body legislative branch called Congress, identified by two bodies, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives, James Madison won, and there is representation based on population, while the Senate, William Patterson won, and there's representation based on equal distribution among the states. Additionally, we see the adaptation of three branches of government through the legislative, executive, and judicial, with checks and balances as they have power and influence over each other, hopefully, and at ideal times, equal power and influence over each other. And additionally, we see William Patterson had another win there, as we did later implement a Supreme Court, which is addressed in our Constitution, and a federal agency to tax trade. So we see the compromise between these two proposals that resulted in the United States Constitution eventually being ratified. Well, the United States Constitution originally being proposed and then later ratified. So, what did I just describe? Well, that great compromise, it was the compromise between, the great compromise is the compromise between the Virginia and New Jersey plan. And that is where we implemented bicameralism in the United States. So what is the great compromise? The compromise established by well, what is the Great Compromise? It is the compromise between the Virginia and New Jersey plan in which we established bicameralism in the United States with a two-body legislature. Bicameralism is the division of power within the legislative branch, the branch that writes laws, in two bodies, two distinct bodies, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And we remember, based on high school history and based on the debate between the Virginia and New Jersey plan, that the number of representatives in the House of Representatives is determined by population, proportional representation, while each state has equal representation in the Senate. We see both plans being represented in the Great Compromise with where we implemented bicameralism in the United States. Now, additionally, we do remember that that was not the only compromise made. We remember that Virginia was the largest state at the time. They had a significant population, but among that population were a significant number of enslaved individuals. And when we determine the population of these states, as it is a very important metric because that is how we determine how much influence we have over the House of Representatives, how do we count individuals that are free in comparison to individuals who are currently enslaved? Well, this is referred to as the Three-Fifths Compromise. I personally, verbally, and never in any written document or quiz or test, like to refer to it as the Not-So-Great Compromise. Please never write that and never remember it that way. That will not result in you getting points. I just like saying we had a great compromise, the great compromise, and a not-so-great one, the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise states representatives in the House will be determined by population, and when considering the population of these states, quote, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons, end quote. We see those enslaved were only counted as 3/5 of a person towards the greater population count. This I include because we all remember it in high school, but I also include in our lecture because we have to remember that it takes some not great compromises at times it to be able to form a great nation like the United States. So we see through great agreements and not so great agreements, the Constitutional Convention addressed the concerns of those on both sides of the debate, both Federalists and Anti-Federalists, those who believe in complete opposition of each other when it comes to the way a system of government should be implemented. Some very morally great compromises, some history can tell morally questionable compromises, resulted in an agreement between conflicting parties. An agreement that resulted in the United States Constitution and later the Bill of Rights, which was ratified just a few years later. So the U.S. Constitution. Before this, it is important to understand that states had their own individual constitutions prior to the drafting of the national constitution. Other nations also had constitutions on the international arena. The U.S. Constitution specifically was ratified between the years of 1787 and 1790, and this was done on a state-by-state basis. We did not have the Constitution immediately implemented after the Constitutional Convention of 1787. It took until 1790, 3 years later, for us to have a ratified and accessible United States Constitution. This replaced the Articles of Confederation, which was far too weak, revealed by the Shays Rebellion, and later relied upon the ratification of a Bill of Rights that was ratified a year later in 1791. So we see that the U.S. Constitution, originally ratified, did not include the Bill of Rights. It was first ratified by Delaware in 1787, quickly following the Constitutional Convention. And finally, the last state to align in the ratification process was Rhode Island in 1790, after not even sending delegates to the United States Constitutional Convention of 1787. Fascinating little moment in history. A little bit of a holdout there, Rhode Island. So we remember the Great Compromise as well, where we implement a Supreme Court, 3 branches of government. We implement the Great Compromise, bicameralism, the division of legislature into House of Representatives and the Senate, and this is done through a compromise as we have the Virginia plan with within the House of Representatives with population based on, distribution based on population, and the New Jersey plan winning out with equal distribution of seats among the Senate. And here's a bit of review on the last few slides. Since we're going a little bit long, I will not spend too much time discussing this, but we, in early American history, understood the failures of the Articles of Confederation and went through a transitionary period of constant debate, engagement, conflict verbally, but eventually resulting in agreement between conflicting sides, which later resulted in the United States Constitution that lives until this very day, only having been amended 17 times since this very day. Well, 27 times, but the Bill of Rights just a year later, first 10. Yeah. So the first draft of the Bill of Rights. Did James Madison, well, it's important to note, James Madison wrote the Bill of Rights, which was a document restricting the central government and providing individual liberties to these states. In his original proposal, he originally proposed 19, but 17 amendments were accepted by the House of Representatives. And then, when it reached the next body, 12 amendments were accepted and approved by the Senate. And then, when it went through the ratification process, which we will cover towards the end of this class on how to implement change in the United States through constitutional amendments, the final step of that process, the ratification process, 10 amendments were accepted on the state level. When we look at the amendments that were rejected or amended to be kind of merged in with others, we see that the First Amendment, these include the First Amendment, which originally regulated the number of citizens per representative. We also see the Second Amendment, which was originally in James Madison's original proposal. These are the ones that they the order that they maintained. The Second Amendment originally was one that stated Congress shall not increase pay to representatives until after an election. This, and of course these are brief summaries of these amendments, this Second Amendment is now our 27th Amendment. We will talk about that later on in this course. The Third Amendment originally stated Congress shall make no law establishing a religion or prohibit the free exercise thereof. This eventually became the First Amendment. We also see amendments focusing on stating that no one can appeal the ruling of the Supreme Court, provides protections for checks and balances, and emphasizes the role of the three branches, while we had two other amendments that were merged with others that originally focused on fair judicial procedures. So we see the first version of James Madison's Bill of Rights was first accepted with 17 amendments by the House of Representatives, 12 amendments by the Senate, and 10 by the ratification process on the state level. We see, based on James Madison's first proposal, 17 were originally accepted by the House of Representatives. Now the Bill of Rights, the guiding document for individual liberties within the United States. We know through selective incorporation that we have these 10 amendments defending our individual liberties, but we understand, which we'll go into more detail actually later on about selective incorporation, but we understand that these 10 amendments originally restricted the federal central government and provided protections for state governments. As we see, the federal government cannot infringe upon our free speech, assembly, or right to religious affiliations. We cannot have our central government restrict our right to bear arms in a well-regulated militia. We can't have them forcing us to house and quarter soldiers. We cannot be forced to open up to unreasonable search and seizures. We have fair court procedures focused in this document, as there is no double jeopardy. We protect one from being a witness against themselves. If you've heard the classic, lines, I always reference the Chappelle Show, but it's a bit outdated nowadays, as he says, "I plead the fifth." So the fifth means you cannot, you must not be expected to be a witness against yourself. We also see the Sixth Amendment, speedy and public trials. Seventh Amendment, you have a right to trial by jury of peers. Eighth Amendment, we cannot have cruel and unusual punishment. This is a fascinating amendment as it provides an opportunity to engage in a discussion about the differences in interpretation of our guiding document. The Eighth Amendment says you cannot have cruel and unusual punishment. It is important to note the use of the word "and." Originalists, those who interpret our Constitution strictly, word by word, as the founders wrote them, could identify this as stating that in the United States you can have cruel and you can have unusual punishment, as long as they do not occur simultaneously. Now, there is a segment of those who interpret our Constitution, referred to as living constitutionalists, who would say the Constitution is a guiding document that with each generation must be able to breathe and change in its interpretation. Those would consider the Eighth Amendment as meaning to state that you cannot have cruel or unusual punishment, meaning that both cruel and unusual punishment are abolished in the United States. Regardless of interpretation, we see that this is interpreted as there is no cruel or unusual punishment in the United States. Additionally, the Ninth Amendment, no amendment shall override rights granted by the Constitution, basically stating you cannot have an amendment that overrides those previously listed in these amendments without directly stating so within the amendment. It's a bit nuanced, but basically, simply put, everything said prior cannot be undone by anything said in the future. Now we see the 10th Amendment. This is one that comes up frequently in debates about state rights. This is an amendment that states all power that is not delegated to the federal government shall be granted to the states and the people. An important caveat of that amendment, the states and the people. This is why you see various legislation, this is why you see policies varying between states within the United States. Specifically, we understand the best example of marijuana consumption laws within the United States. As states like Montana, it is legal for adults, and other states, like I don't know others that are not here, that restrict your right to consume and purchase those products. So we see that is a result of our 10th Amendment. Now, every lecture we do in this course will have what did we learn slides. In these slides, I will ask you direct questions, and then I will provide an additional slide right after it, which I provide you with direct answers. When you study for your quizzes, for the final exam, when you're sitting there saying, wow, Devin likes to ramble a lot, what are we expected to remember? Go to the What Did We Learn slides. Ask yourself these questions. What type of democracy is present in the United States? If you remember from the lecture, you see, well, we're a constitutional republic, but that doesn't directly state what kind of democracy we have. Or we're not a direct democracy because I don't have to tell the government what to do every day. I do elect people. Oh, we're a representative democracy. That's what it is. So that's what's expected of you. You have to remember that answer. I have the answer to all of these questions in just a slide. So please ask yourself those questions. Give yourself a little quiz after listening to the lecture and make sure you had the correct answers by reviewing it in the next slide. And make sure you understand that this is the primary expectation, that you can answer those questions with these primary points of information by the end of this week. What is due this week? Well, it's week 1, so there's really not too much due. The one thing that you have to focus on is your discussion post requirement. So make sure you go through that document, you look at what's required of you, but make sure you post to the introduction thread because I want to get to know you. I want your classmates to be able to get to know you. So introduce yourself. If we were in person, I would be making everybody go around the classroom, telling everybody their favorite colors and whatnot. So tell us your favorite colors and everything else I asked you in that discussion thread. And make sure you also contribute to week 1 discussion on democracy, in which I ask you a question about the slide in which I provided different definitions of democracy. And I ask for your own personal opinion. That's where you're going to be able to present and represent yourself, is through the discussion threads. Now, I also want to address, if you are nervous about representing your political opinions and beliefs in discussion threads, you do not have to be abrasive. You do not have to represent everything you think. You have to engage with the content by talking about whatever angle you can think of. I ask you what definition of democracy you identify with. It is not problematic to say you believe in the third, first, or second definition of democracy. It is not problematic to say that when I think about the definition of democracy, I think it's very important to cover these, this, that, and that point. You can contribute to these threads, although I'm asking for your opinions, in very moderate ways, without presenting a partisan opinion at all. If you want help representing your beliefs and thoughts without it being a partisan thing, and it's just a neutral analysis of information, I am happy to work with you. And please, please, if you read somebody's discussion post and you feel a bit offended or thrown off by what they're saying, do 2 things. Make sure you're trying your best to understand the definitions they rely upon. What foundations are they using to make these assessments that you might differ on? And then 2, try and provide the definitions and foundations that you rely on that they might not understand adequately about the counterposition. And then ask them a question. Not, why would you say this? But instead, what foundations make you think that this is the best approach in this environment, or however you want to frame your question. But ask a question that is fruitful and engaging and, above all, respectable. I do not want conflict in these discussions. I want us to be adults who can have respectable and responsible conversations about the systems that govern our lives, because if we cannot do that, what can we do? So, this is the last slide in week 1. It's great to meet you guys. I hope you email me. I hope you rant with me. I hope you call me, text me, whatever it is. I hope I'm sitting there on Zoom with a lot of you throughout this course. And I hope we can all learn alongside each other. This is a fun course. Rarely do you have content that can pull people from countless majors, yet be able to give every single one of you something that can strengthen your ability to represent yourself in the system you live within. So thank you guys. It's great to meet you. I'm excited to work with you. And yeah, reach out with any questions about the course, content, or my personality, whatever it may be that you desire. I'm excited to talk to you guys. I'm excited to work with you. Here's to an amazing semester of American government. Woo!